In the Red River parishes, there was a name white men did not like to write down. Jonah, not Jonah with a family name, not Jonah from a town anyone could point to on a map, just Jonah, a name spoken the way men speak about fever, fire, or a shape moving between the trees after midnight. By 1859, the sheriffs from 3 parishes knew him only as a pattern. A burned cotton gin outside Bayou Chicot. 2 patrol riders found dead beside a wagon road. A planter's strongbox opened, not for money, but for papers. 23 enslaved people gone from one plantation before breakfast, leaving nothing behind but cold ash, empty pallets, and chains cut clean through. No committee claimed him. No abolition society admitted knowing him. No witness ever gave the same description twice. Some said he was tall. Some swore he was short. Some said he limped. Some said he moved so quietly that dogs stopped barking when he passed. But in the quarters, after the lamps in the big house went dark, people spoke with more certainty. They said Jonah was real, and they said he was not running from slavery anymore. He was making slavery run from him. The boy who became Jonah was born in 1833. On a small place 7 miles west of Camden, Arkansas, where the pine woods thinned toward bottomland and the roads turned to red mud after rain. The owner was Silas Varn, a man who liked to call his farm modest, as if modesty made bondage gentler. He owned 54 acres, 16 enslaved people, 2 mules, and a cotton patch that never produced enough to make him rich, but always produced enough to make him cruel when prices fell. Jonah's mother was named Leah. No one wrote a surname for her in the farm book. The ledger only called her Leah, housewoman, 31, sound condition. Sound condition. That was how the Varn accounts described the woman who rose before dawn, cooked over smoke until her eyes watered, washed linen with cracked hands, carried water, swept floors, and kept a child alive in a world designed to turn both of them into entries on a page. Leah had been purchased near Natchez for $320. The amount appeared in black ink beside transport fees, tax notes, and the cost of a cracked plow blade. The system had a place for every expense, even grief. In May of 1844, when Jonah was 11, Leah dropped a tray in the dining room. Not silver, not crystal, a cheap painted tray that had already begun to split at one corner. But Mrs. Varn had guests from town, and the sound of that tray striking the floor embarrassed her more than the damage mattered. Everyone in the room stopped speaking. Mrs. Varn looked at Leah. Leah looked at the floor. And Jonah, who had been sweeping the back hall, froze with the broom still in his hands. The overseer, Harlan Price, was called from the yard. 25 lashes. That was the punishment. Not because a tray had broken, because it had broken in front of people whose opinion mattered. Punishment, in that world, was never only about pain. It was theater. It was instruction. It was a warning delivered through one body to everyone else. The house servants were made to stand near the kitchen wall. The field hands were pulled in from the rows. Jonah was placed where he could see. He counted because a child's mind will reach for anything that turns horror into order. 1, 2, 3. By the 9th, Leah's knees had started to bend. By the 17th, the sky had gone heavy and green, the color it gets before a storm. By the 25th, she was still silent. That silence became the first thing Jonah ever hated and loved at the same time. He hated that she had to spend her last strength denying them the sound they wanted. He loved that she had kept one thing from them, her cry. Leah died before midnight. The farm ledger did not say murdered. It did not say beaten. It did not say Harlan Price. It said, Leah, lost by fever after correction. Fever after correction. Silas Varn paid $2.75 for a pine box, charged the cost to household loss, and wrote her value against the year's accounts. That was the moment Jonah understood the world he lived in. Not fully, not with words, but with a child's cold, permanent clarity. The people who owned the ledgers could turn a mother into numbers. So one day, he would make numbers bleed. For 3 years, nothing about Jonah appeared dangerous. He worked. He answered when spoken to. He kept his eyes lowered. He took blows without raising his hands. Harlan Price called him dull. Silas Varn called him broken. Both men were wrong. Jonah was watching. He watched how patrols searched when someone ran. They went north first, always north, toward the rumors of free soil, ferry crossings, hidden routes, and men who would pay for a runaway's return. So Jonah learned the South. He learned the cypress breaks where horses sank to the knee. He learned the sloughs that swallowed scent. He learned which creek beds held water in August and which turned to cracked clay. He learned that Spanish moss could hide a face, that cane thickets could hide a body, and that white men called a place empty when they were simply afraid to enter it. He watched the dogs. He watched the gates. He watched which men drank in town on Saturdays, and which roads they used coming back. Most of all, he watched Harlan Price. Price rode to Camden twice a month. He used the same road. He stopped at the same bend to water his horse. He came home slower after whiskey. Jonah stored these facts the way Silas Varn stored debts, line by line. In September of 1847, Jonah vanished. The dogs took his scent to Sandy Creek and lost it in the water. The riders searched north for 2 days. They found no tracks, no blanket, no stolen food, no sign that anyone had helped him. By the 3rd day, Harlan Price told Varn the boy had probably drowned. Jonah's value, estimated at $450, was written down as a loss. But Jonah was not dead. He had walked 6 miles in the creek, barefoot, carrying nothing but a corn knife stolen from the tool shed and wrapped in a flour sack to keep it from shining. When he finally climbed out, he did not head for a town. He did not head for a road. He went deeper into the swamp. The first week nearly killed him. Mosquitoes rose in clouds so thick he breathed them in. His feet split open. He ate green persimmons and vomited in the dark. He drank from brown water and learned the difference between hunger that weakens and hunger that makes the mind sharpen. He slept inside a hollow cypress with his knees to his chest. He woke at every owl call, at every branch snap, at every sound that might have been a dog. But fear, repeated long enough, becomes instruction. By winter, Jonah could move through cane without cutting his skin. He could set a fish trap from split reeds. He could tell fresh horse tracks from old ones by how the mud shone at the edges. He could sit still for hours with ants crawling over his hands. And still, survival was not the plan. Survival was only the school. The plan rode home twice a month on a bay horse, carrying a whip on one side and a pistol on the other. On a cold February night in 1848, Harlan Price left Camden drunk and alone. Jonah followed from the tree line, not rushing, not breathing hard, not feeling the way he imagined a person might feel before revenge. He felt nothing. That frightened him later, but not then. At the bend near Miller's Ford, Price dismounted to fix a loose girth strap. Jonah stepped out of the cane. Price looked up just in time to see the boy he had written off as dead. The corn knife moved once. Price never reached the pistol. Jonah took the weapon, the powder horn, the shot pouch, and the whip. He carried the whip to the creek. He wrapped it around a stone. He dropped it into the water and watched it sink. The pistol he kept. The sheriff called Price's death highway murder. Silas Varn called it frontier lawlessness. The local paper called it another sign of disorder along the border. No one called it Leah. No one called it a ledger being balanced. For the next 11 years, Jonah became a problem the authorities could not name without admitting how badly they had misunderstood the world around them. His method was not wild. That was what terrified them. It was patient. He would spend weeks near a plantation before anything happened, sometimes months. He learned the owner's habits. He learned which overseer was brutal and which one was careless. He learned which enslaved blacksmith could file a chain pin without being noticed. He learned which woman in the laundry heard every conversation from the big house, because white people spoke freely around anyone they refused to see. He did not attack first. He studied first. In 1850, the cotton gin at the Tallow Bin place burned on a moonless night. Not the dwelling house, not the quarters. Only the gin, the lint room, and the record shed decided. The fire started in 3 places at once. By dawn, 82 bales of cotton were gone, along with the account books that listed field hands by age, skill, and estimated value. The owner, Abel Trow, survived. But the season did not. He had borrowed against that cotton. He had promised shipment by river. Without the records, he could not prove half of what he claimed to own. And creditors who had smiled at him in April began calling in notes by June. Trout told anyone who would listen that abolitionists had done it. But in the quarters, people noticed something else. The fire had spared the corn crib, it had spared the smokehouse. It had spared the cabins where people slept. Whoever said it knew what to destroy and what to leave standing. 2 years later, Patrolman Isaac Bell and Monroe Sykes were found beside the lower wagon road, both shot at close range. Their horses were tied to a sweet gum tree, their money was untouched, their guns were untouched, their food, blankets, and whiskey were untouched. Only one thing was missing, a folded packet containing capture papers for 9 people believed to be hiding somewhere between Camden and the Wachita River. Those papers disappeared. So did the 9 people. The sheriff's office spent 6 months chasing rumors. They questioned free black boatmen. They questioned white Methodists with suspicious opinions. They questioned 2 schoolteachers, a ferryman, and a widow who owned no slaves and therefore was automatically considered unreliable. They never questioned the washerwoman who had heard Bell mention his route through an open kitchen window. They never questioned the boy who carried feed to the patrol horses. They never questioned the people they thought of as scenery. That was Jonah's advantage. White authorities saw roads, warrants, fences, and property lines. Jonah saw cooks, children, boat hands, grave diggers, women carrying laundry, men hired out for one day and back by sundown. He saw the invisible country moving underneath the visible one, and he learned to move with it. By 1854, the stories had a shape. A man in a black felt hat, a pistol taken from a dead overseer, a voice that never rose above a whisper, a way of asking only one question when he entered a cabin after midnight. Who is ready to leave? In March of that year, he took 23 people from the Garrow Plantation in one night. That number mattered. 3 or 4 could vanish in confusion. 6 might be hidden by friends. 23 was an insult. It required planning, food caches, creek crossings, false trails, a route that avoided ferries, towns, patrol roads, and anyone who might sell information for reward money. There were children in that group. There was a woman nearly 70 who could not walk more than a mile without stopping. There was a man with irons still locked around one ankle. Jonah had prepared for all of them. He had hidden dried cornmeal in gourds. He had cut cane poles for stretchers. He had marked trees with knife cuts so small they looked like insect damage. He had paid, with stolen coins and favors, a free black cooper near the river to keep a flatboat ready under rotten boards. They left at midnight. By sunrise, the dogs had been sent after them. Jonah split the group into 5 pieces. One went through water. One doubled back over dry leaves. One crossed a cattle yard to confuse the scent. One hid in an abandoned charcoal pit for 6 hours while riders passed 20 yards away. And the slowest group went with Jonah himself. When the elderly woman could not stand, Jonah carried her. Not far, not heroically, just long enough. That was how the story was told afterward. Not that he killed, not that he burned, but that, in the worst hour, he carried someone the system had already decided was too old to matter. All 23 disappeared. The reward jumped to $700, then $1,200, then $2,000. By 1856, planters along the lower river were paying armed men to sleep inside gin houses. Patrol riders traveled in pairs. Overseers stopped drinking in town unless they could return before dark. Some owners began locking their account books in iron chests, as if paper were the thing Jonah hated most. They were close, but not close enough. Jonah did hate the books. He hated the clean handwriting, the columns, the prices, the way a person could become a number so neat it looked harmless. But he understood something deeper. The books were not the system. They were the system telling the truth about itself, and that made them useful. In the summer of 1857, Sheriff Elam Rust began compiling a private file. He was not a foolish man. That made him dangerous. Rust gathered reports from 6 counties and 2 parishes. He compared burn patterns. He studied road ambushes. He interviewed men who had been too embarrassed to admit they were afraid. He noticed that Jonah never struck randomly, never stole what he could not use, never killed children, never burned quarters, never chose spectacle when silence would do. Rusk wrote that the offender was likely a Negro man between 20 and 30 years of age, operating with unusual discipline, local knowledge, and assistance from persons unknown. Persons unknown. That phrase did a lot of work. It allowed Rust to admit Jonah had help without admitting the help might be everywhere. The file was not printed. No public warning was issued. The planters did not want panic. The sheriff did not want embarrassment. The newspapers preferred vague phrases like river disturbances and criminal agitation. But behind courthouse doors, the language changed. Men who would not say Jonah's name in public argued about him for hours. Some wanted militia patrols. Some wanted night curfews for all black workers, free or enslaved. Some wanted to arrest every free black boatman between Camden and Alexandria. Some wanted to raise the reward high enough that greed would do what law had failed to do. By January of 1858, the reward stood at $3,000. A fortune, more than the price of 6 strong field hands. More than many farms were worth after a bad season. Enough money to make friends dangerous and strangers deadly. That was when Jonah made his boldest move. He did not hide from the reward. He answered it. On the first Monday of February, planters gathered at the old parish courthouse to discuss river security. Oil lamps burned on the walls. Mud dried on boot heels. Men spoke in low voices about patrol routes, warehouse guards, and which enslaved workers might be suspected of carrying messages. At some point during that meeting, smoke began to seep under the door. Not from the main hall, from the clerk's room behind them. By the time the men forced the door open, the account shelves were burning. Tax rolls, slave schedules, mortgage filings, reward notices, private correspondence, all stacked in flame. And on the desk, weighted beneath a brass inkwell, lay 1/2 sheet of blue ledger paper. The handwriting was careful. 4 words. The river keeps account. No one saw who left it. The courthouse did not burn to the ground. Jonah had not tried to destroy the building. He had burned the room that taught men to confuse ownership with truth. After that, fear became harder to hide. The name Jonah spread beyond the quarters and into white conversation, though never comfortably. Mothers used it to frighten children indoors. Overseers cursed it when dogs lost a trail. Planters blamed it for every broken lock, missing horse, burned shed, or field hand who smiled at the wrong time. But among the enslaved, the meaning was different. Jonah was not safety. No one living in bondage mistook one man for safety. He could not be everywhere. He could not stop every whipping. He could not open every chain. His existence could even bring punishment down on people who had never met him. Some feared his name for that reason. Some said he brought fire too close to the quarters. Some said vengeance was a hard road that swallowed anyone who walked it too long. They were not wrong. But hope does not always arrive clean. Sometimes hope is only the knowledge that the master can bleed, that the patrol can be fooled, that the road has more than one direction, that a ledger is not the same as a life. The last confirmed act attributed to Jonah happened in November of 1859. A river warehouse at Pecan Point burned just before dawn. Inside were cotton bales waiting for shipment, 2 locked cabinets of bills of sale, and a new iron safe that the owner had bragged could survive any fire. It did. The papers inside did not. Someone had opened the safe before the fire began. The cotton loss was estimated at nearly $5,000. The records loss could not be estimated at all. Witnesses reported a black man seen near the levee. One said he was tall. One said he was slight. One said his face was scarred. One said he wore a preacher's coat. One said he had no coat at all. The only detail they agreed on was that he walked toward the cypress before sunrise and did not look back. After that, the pattern stopped. No more sign messages. No more spectacular fires. No more patrol riders found with missing papers. No more mass disappearances that planters could point to and say, that was him. Sheriff Rusk kept the reward posted until the war began and the entire world those men were trying to protect started cracking under cannon smoke. By then, Jonah was already more useful as a rumor than as a man. Some said he died of fever in the swamp. Some said he crossed into Mexico. Some said a planter's son shot him and buried him under a roadbed. Some said he joined the Union camp under another name when the war came. Some said he never left the river at all. The freed people told a quieter version. They said Jonah got old, that he stopped burning buildings because the war was burning the whole country without him, that he watched soldiers march over roads he had once crossed barefoot, that he lived long enough to see men in blue uniforms read freedom aloud to people who had already carried freedom in whispers for years. No record proves that. No grave has been found. No photograph has been identified. No court ever tried him. No newspaper ever printed his true face. What survived were fragments. A sheriff's private file. A burned corner of blue ledger paper. A reward notice folded so many times the ink cracked along the creases. And a letter written in 1891 by a woman named Esther Colby, who had been a child on the Garrow place when 23 people vanished in the night. Her handwriting shook. Her memory did not. She wrote, "We never saw his face clear. That was how he wanted it. But we knew the sound of him, not his voice. The sound people made after he passed through. The next morning, the quarters would be afraid, yes, but they would be standing straighter. Somebody had told the masters no and lived long enough for us to hear about it. That may be the truest record Jonah ever left. Not the men he killed. Not the money he destroyed, not the buildings he burned, but the posture he returned to people who had been trained to bow. The system had written Leah as property. It had written Jonah as loss. It had written every stolen child, every sale, every whipping, every broken family into books that pretended ink could make evil orderly. Jonah wrote back in the only language that system respected. Cost. He made cruelty expensive. He made patrols nervous. He made ledgers vulnerable. He made roads uncertain after dark. And for 11 years, along the Red River, the men who bought and sold human beings lived with a thought they could not put back to sleep. Somewhere beyond the lamps, beyond the fences, beyond the reach of their papers, a man they had counted as lost was still counting them. They kept ledgers on bodies. And the river kept the account.